This house in Pompeii is the perfect example of a conventional Roman home. You come through the front door into a grand formal hall with several rooms off it, a pool for collecting water, and opposite the front door, a reception room cum study called, in Latin, the tablinum. The standard view is that this is where the master of the house presided, dressed in his toga, receiving his guests. While at the back of the house, in the private quarters, is where we find the wife and kids, and the cook slaving away over a hot oven.
The problem with that is there's a touch of the Frankie Howard Mr. and Mrs. Pompeii about it. Or, to put it another way, it's temptation for us to take a rather idealising image of our own families, dress them up in togas, add a couple of slaves, and say, hey presto, that's the Roman family. And it's not actually entirely wrong, and there's some quite strikingly familiar things about a Roman house, right down to some of them having a beware of the dog sign at the front door. But if you look a bit harder, you find it isn't quite so simple.
So how do we start to bring back to life what really went on within the walls of a Roman home? And how do we get close to a real Roman family? Well, the best way is to look at what the Romans themselves tell us from beyond the grave. When you come into a place like this, what first hits you in the eye are the statues of the rich, stern emperors and ladies with expensive hairdos. But if you look behind them, you'll find thousands of ordinary Roman voices, compelling us to read their stories. Some have forked out on portraits, others on just a few lines of text. But they all give you clues about who they lived with and who they loved.
Here's a cute little boy with his pet dog. Here's a dad. He's commemorating his daughter, Julia. There she is, really natty hairdo. She must have been quite fashion conscious, I think.
But one of the most striking things about all these tombstones is how Roman husbands and wives portray themselves in death. And if you want to know why we've inherited such a traditional view of the Roman family, then the best place to start is with Roman marriage.
So this is one end of a big Roman marble coffin. We don't know who was originally inside it, but this end at least talks to us about marriage. Got a husband, wife, and they're holding hands. That's the absolutely classic image of the Roman married couple. It's really such a cliched logo of Roman marriage that stone carvers would have churned these things out by the dozen. This will all be prepared, and the stonemason will just put your faces onto the heads. Whatever it looks like, it isn't an equal relationship, though. In the stereotype, the husband has all the control, the wife's job is to serve him every which way. You even get some Roman epitaphs that sum up a woman's life just by listing her service. She talked nicely, she walked nicely, she had kids, she kept house, she made wool, enough said. And it goes right to the top of Roman society too. There's a lovely story about the Empress Livia, the scheming, poisoning wife of the Emperor Augustus. She's supposed to have taken great care that people saw her in the imperial palace itself, spinning and weaving the wool for her husband's togas. That was what Roman women were supposed to do.
On the surface, then, these tombstones show us a rather poised, cool, even cold view of Roman marriage. But tombstones tend to give that impression even today. They trade in cliches. But there's plenty of other evidence that helps us get behind these stereotyped impressions. At the British Museum in London is a wonderful collection of Roman rings covered in the same imagery.
They look pretty familiar to us. We know actually that what we call the wedding finger was the favourite place to put a ring. Some Roman doctors thought there was a direct link between that finger and the heart. But it's hard to get through these sort of standardised images of the clasped hands. But just occasionally you can. And this ring here, it's a pretty plain ring, but in the centre it's got, written on it in Latin, Te amo parum, which means literally, I love you not enough, I don't love you enough. It's kind of slightly odd at first sight. It's particularly odd to imagine that you would give a rather expensive gold ring to somebody to say, here you are, have this lovely ring, but I don't care for you that much. I think it's probably a bit cleverer than that, and I think what the message must mean is, I can't love you possibly as much as you deserve to be loved. You are so fantastic and gorgeous and lovable, but nobody could love you as much as you ought to be loved. It's a wonderfully rare, really rare glimpse of somebody's kind of personal voice sort of shouting through these rather cliched images of marriage.
That ring hints at some of the passion you can find in Roman relationships. But it's also there if you look beyond the man's voice and think about it from the woman's side. Scattered across Rome is an amazing trio of tombstones, which, although still written by men, give us a much more intimate and more honest portrait of their partners.
You have to be a bit careful about what husbands and wives say about each other on their epitaphs. They do tell such terrible whoppers about their marriage. We lived together for 30 years without a cross word. I don't imagine that that could have been any more true in ancient Rome than it is now. But just occasionally, you find someone who comes a bit off-centre, breaks through those cliches, and really conjures up a character. This is a great example. It's the tombstone of a woman called Glyconis, put up by her husband. Now, Glyconis is a Greek name, and it means sweet. So she's sweetie. And he says that, in fact. He says she's sweet by name, but even sweeter by nature. She didn't like to be all proper and austere, he says. She much preferred to be a bit wild, lascivos, rather sexy, suaves. She liked to get a bit drenched in Bacchus. Now, Bacchus is the god of wine. So what he's saying is she was a bit of a wild thing, and she really liked a drink or two. It's a pity, he says, she didn't live forever.
After all that affection, the next one reveals a much darker side to Roman marriage.
Here's another tombstone, which doesn't look very special, but it's got a horrible sting in the tail. It's put up by a husband and wife. He's called Restutus Piscinasus, and the wife is called Prima Restuta. And they put it up, fake errant, to Prima Florentia, their dearest daughter, filiae carissimae, dearest daughter. So far, so ordinary. But how did she die? She was thrown, decepta est, in Tiberi, into the Tiber, by her husband, Orpheus. She was just 16 and a half years old. If Mum and Dad are right, this was a case of domestic murder. I'm afraid some things never change.
The woman in this last tombstone deserves to be a lot more famous than she is. Her story gives us a very different view on Roman virtue and fidelity.
And it's put up to a woman called Alia Potestas. And she's an ex-slave. She's a liberta of a man called Aulus, her partner. Starts off with some pretty standard praise for a Roman woman. She was always the first to get out of bed in the morning and the last to go to bed at night, i.e. she was doing all the housework. Then starts to get a bit weirder. Because the writer becomes a bit strangely explicit about her body. He says here she'd got lovely snow white breasts and small nipples, and that her arms and legs were beautifully smooth. And then he explains why. It's because she was a very active depilator. She sought out every little hair and plucked it out. But it gets even weirder than that. This woman had actually 2 lovers that she was living with. One household held them all. Una Domus held them all, and they lived in a spirit of perfect harmony. This is, in other words, a Roman ménage à trois. But after she died, the blokes went their separate ways, and they're now growing old apart. If you wanted just one example of how Roman relationships could be as messy, as murky, and as mixed up as our own, it would have to be the household of Alia Potestas. I can't help wondering, though, what Alia Potestas' version of the story about these guys would have been.
So if these 3 voices tell us how we can fill the Roman home with a more unexpected set of occupants, what about the house itself? Well, if you look beyond those rather posh houses in Pompeii with their grand entrance halls and expensive paintings, you'll find that Roman homes came in just as many shapes and sizes as their relationships.